Namaskar and welcome to this exciting new episode of Sattology Debunking Mythology. Sat means truth and logos in Latin means a study or science. So Sattology means the science of truth or the study of truth. A true antonym of Sattology is mythology, which myth in Sanskrit is a Sanskrit word, means the science is means a fake imagination or something without proof, anything historical record. Nowadays, when you combine with logos, it becomes a study of fake imagination or something without proof. And so all the ancient history was clubbed as mythology. And whereas we say at least the Indian history has a lot of astronomical, geographical proofs of the incidents that happened. And those places still exist in the entire Asia. And some parts of Europe also we are finding Indian Hindu deities. So So today we have a very important guest. Today we are talking something else. We're talking about the mindset in South Asia. And we have an expert, strategic expert from India. He's written books, articles, and he's very famous in the New Delhi circuit and he's part of the director at India Foundation. So which is a foundation run by very big political names in India. And he's one of the directors there. So without delay, let us welcome Sri Come Carpentier.
Greetings to all. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yeah, we can hear you very clearly. The whole world is confused about, everybody knows that Pakistan had a Hindu history and many Hindu religious places are inside Pakistan, many of them, including the Indian text. Mahabharat was spoken in Takshila, which is in Jiljil Baltistan area of Pakistan. And there are other cities in Balik. Balik is again northwest Pakistan. And after that, these are all in Ramayana. Everywhere it is covered in detail. So mindset is the same, similar mindset, but there is so much animosity from that country towards India. So where does that originate from? It's very difficult for Americans or many of us to even get it.
You have pointed the finger at some of the issues which have divided Pakistan from India, right from beginning in the early part of the 20th century, when a movement for Islamic autonomy, as it were, arose under British rule. With incitement and encouragement from the British, many Indian Muslims proclaimed their intention and their commitment to establish a separate state, a separate society, in order to preserve their culture, their political influence amongst the Hindu majority. And therefore, it was originally proposed that much of western, northern, and northeastern India would break up and become a Muslim state. I won't go into the details of political history because they are well known, at least to those who wish to study them, and they have been discussed many, many times over the last 70, 80 years. However, what has resulted from that is a very divided subcontinent, especially between Pakistan and India, because Bangladesh has taken a separate course. But we all know that there is still very strong Islamic and therefore pro-Pakistani influence at play in Bangladesh. And therefore, there is always a question about what would happen if Bangladesh were to again emphasize politically its Muslim identity and therefore get closer to Pakistan, which apparently many Bangladeshi Muslims would like to see happen, in spite of the fact that Bangladesh is first and foremost Bengal, and therefore has a Bengali culture, which is quite different from the, you might call it the Urdu Persian culture, predominant culture of Pakistan. Now, with regard to the mindset, I think you have to differentiate very clearly between the mindsets of the Indians in the north, especially in the northwest, who were expelled, who had to live at great risk for their lives in order to escape a possible massacre in Pakistan. And we all know that many of them were indeed killed. And there were riots on both sides of what is now the border, what became the border in 1947. And we all know that the British essentially washed their hands at that time and decided that it was business between the Pakistanis and the Indians, whereas they would take the high road and say, well, we are no longer ruling you, so you do what you want. And of course, that ended very badly, or at least it began very badly, because there were extensive killings and massacres, and an enduring hatred has remained among many people. Probably more on the Indian side than on the Pakistani side. I'm qualifying this because Indians were victimized, especially in the Punjab. And therefore, those who came to India from Pakistan remember not only what they lost materially, but the members of their families who were killed, often savagely so. The Pakistanis, on the other hand, feel that very often that it was a big misunderstanding and that the Indians, being Hindus, were oppressive and were a threat to their Muslim identity, and therefore that it was only fair that they would get a country to themselves, which is Pakistan. Of course, they wanted the country to be much bigger. They wanted it to include part of what is now northern India, including Kashmir and at least parts of what is now Uttar Pradesh in India and Bihar, so that they could essentially have a Muslim arc all the way from the west to the Bengal east. Now, this didn't happen, and Pakistan has remained very envious and feeling as a sort of sort of much less successful sibling, which now is known mostly for its problems. Because whenever people think of Pakistan, they tend to think of terrorism, war in Afghanistan, civil conflicts, great poverty, runaway demography. I mean, Pakistan now has 210 million people. It is the fifth largest country in the world by population, on a territory which is only about the size of France and Italy put together. So obviously there is immense overpopulation, which leads to massive immigration towards the West, but also in many cases towards India, insofar as is possible. Now, as a result, what you have now is India with 1.3 billion people, which is making strides in many fields and therefore becoming a major power in the world. Even without meaning to be that, there is an inevitability about India's economic dynamism, economic size, demographic size, technological and scientific capabilities, which makes it one of the 6-7 major countries in the world by any standards. On the other hand, you have Pakistan, which has mostly problems, and a Muslim identity which, in a way, holds it back into a sort of Middle Eastern corner, when in fact Pakistan is not a Middle Eastern country. It is a South Asian country, and the identity problems Pakistanis have is that they are not quite sure whether they can relate best to Iran or to the Arab Peninsula, especially Saudi Arabia. But they also know that they are not really accepted as equals, either by the Turks, by the Iranians, or the Arabs, who regard them as Indian Muslims, who therefore are at a somewhat lower rank in terms of not only the economic achievements, but also the culture, and particularly the familiarity with Islam. And of course, Islam was born in Arabia, and Iran has its own pride as a great civilization, which stands on its own, whereas Pakistan's civilization cannot be separate from Indian civilization. We all know that Pakistan, as part of India, was a very important center of the so-called Harappan or Indus Valley culture, which is now better known as Saraswati, Yamuna, Indus Valley culture. And Pakistan has inherited many of the sites of the Harappan culture, which are in some cases more than 5,000 years old. But still, for Pakistan, there is an identity problem because anything pre-Islamic or non-Islamic is not seen as the core of the culture, of the civilization. And on the other hand, everything that is Islamic is in fact imported. I mean, of course, Pakistan has produced great Islamic scholars and philosophers and Sufis, but that was before it was Pakistan. That is when it was part of the greater North Indian sultanates and of Mughal Empire. So whatever Pakistan is now is still to be to evolve, and as a result, on the one hand, there is a great nostalgia of united India among Pakistanis, but they would like this united India to be under some sort of Muslim supremacy or as a sort of a new Mughal empire, which obviously is not feasible in a democratic world. And that has led to this great psychological conflict in Pakistan. On the other hand, India, naturally, especially among its nationalist Hindu citizens, sees itself as a subcontinent which should not have been divided. And therefore, considering that India has more than 100 million Muslims, probably close to 200 million, there is no real reason for Pakistan to be a separate country, if you think of it, because Pakistan had a raison d'etre if it had united all Muslims, leaving India only with Hindus and its other religions. And yet that hasn't happened. Therefore, the Pakistanis are Muslims who chose to be separate, or at least who are heirs and the descendants of those who chose to separate, or who were forced to separate. And on the other hand, you have the Muslims who are part of India and who obviously are not going to go to Pakistan for all sorts of reasons, social, economic, and the very fact that they are settled in India, they belong to India, and they have no intention of emigrating to a country which is now foreign to them. So the idea that Jinnah exploited of a Muslim state for Muslims is not really very feasible, very tenable. And this leads to some real identity issues among Pakistanis. And obviously, when Pakistan compares itself to India, many of the great shrines and the monuments of the Muslim past of India are in India, not in Pakistan. Therefore, for Pakistanis, the Taj Mahal obviously is a sort of an icon of the Muslim glory, and yet it's not in their territory. On the other hand, many of the great sages and scholars of ancient India, as you hinted, were born in Pakistan. I mean, we can talk of Panini, who is regarded as the greatest grammarian of the ancient world. And we can talk about many others. And they were in what is now Pakistan, between Rawalpindi and Peshawar. And therefore, we have to look at culturally a greater India, which is called Akhand Bharat, undivided India, as a historical and cultural entity, in which Pakistan is a recent avatar. It's almost like a sultanate. I mean, India has had many sultanates throughout its history. Many parts of India became independent sultanates. And Pakistan seems to be the most modern version of that.
Oh, great point you said. I think you stole the words from my mouth, because whatever they feel pride, when I see Pakistani Americans here, most of them are, I don't know where they get the history lessons from. And they every single Pakistani American that I meet, they say their ancestors were from Iraq, Iran. It's so confusing. Like their identity is completely given to other countries. Now they don't have their identity. They have no pride in calling themselves a Pakistani American. They say we are Persian descent. They'll say I'm Iraqi descent. And these are the big Pakistani people, or we are Afghanis. So they Pakistan as a nation doesn't exist even in their mind. And you said it rightly, that their identity is confused for themselves also, because historically it has always been a province of India. And when they were a province of India, they were one of the best economies in the world, because the trade used to flow from India through Pakistan via Afghanistan to Central Asia. This is how it used to flow. So they cannot exist. And we have seen that in last 70 years, the human rights violations against their own people have skyrocketed, and which the world is beginning to recognize now slowly. And there are so many separatist movements in Pakistan who want to come back to India. Many of them are openly saying that. So, with the cultural part and the identity crisis being there, what do you think is the result? What have they done in last 70 years that today they are ashamed? Many Pakistani Americans, they are ashamed to call their Pakistan identity. Actually, they hide it. They either call themselves Indian, and all the restaurants are called Indian and Indian names. Desi factory. The moment you see the word Desi, you know that it's a Pakistani restaurant, because they will not say Pakistani. I have no, like, I could not understand. What do you think? What is the reason behind that?
If you look at modern history, I mean, the last 20 years, you can very well understand why there would be a problem. Obviously, perfectly innocent, decent, and law-abiding Pakistanis have to confront an atmosphere, I mean, often suspicious reactions from people who don't know any better, who just think of, terrorist acts and wars and the unrest. So naturally, being a Pakistani, let's face it, is not easy unless you belong to a very elite family and you are in the circles of great power. Otherwise, naturally, you don't benefit from a great deal of support, especially if you are poor. So I can fully understand and appreciate their dilemma and their quandary. Now, as far as it's true that throughout the Muslim world, people will tend to claim descent, truly or not, from Arabic or Iranian ancestors. You find that in North Africa, you find that in West Africa, you find that in all parts of Asia where Muslims live, simply because there have been, of course, great flows of invaders, traders, soldiers from the heartlands of Islam, that is the Arabian Peninsula, Syria, Iraq, outwards towards other parts of the world. And as a result, a lot of people do have ancestors who came from the Muslim heartland. But let's face it, it's also possible that many who didn't claim that distinction, because if you are a Muslim, naturally you partake in the culture that originated in the Muslim heartland. And there are, as you know, in India, millions of people who are descended from the Prophet or from the Sahaba, his companions. And as a result, there is a sort of common Muslim identity which is built around the Quranic core, which, as I said, is primarily from what we call West Asia and the Middle East. Now, what's very interesting is that in India, for example, we know that for centuries, Punjabi Islam has been one of the most vigorous and rich, creative regions of Islamic thought, culture, spirituality, and also material prosperity. So United Punjab had more people, and even, of course, now has even more people than most other Muslim regions. And therefore, among Western Islamologists, there has been for quite a few years a particular interest in what is called Punjabi Islam, because it is true that Punjabi Islam is demographically more important than Middle Eastern Islam or North African Islam. You know, between West Punjab and East Punjab, I mean, and of course the rest of northern India, you have a huge number of Muslims who have made major contributions to Islamic civilization. So obviously the fact is that if you talk to Punjabis, whether in India or Pakistan, they still know that they have a common culture and a common heritage. On the other hand, if you go to Central India and South India, the connection with Pakistan becomes so tenuous as to be inexistent. And in South India, Pakistan is a very remote thing. Maybe it has a greater affinity with South Indian Muslims, but by and large, there is really no interest in Pakistan and no sense of community. Why? Because the languages are different. the traditions are different, and very physical distance creates a certain estrangement. So the issue between India and Pakistan, I would say, is primarily between Punjabis, to a lesser extent between Sindhis and Gujaratis, who are neighbors and who have been trading and doing business together for thousands of years, and to a lesser extent in the Ganga Yamuna belt, UP, Bihar, because there you have a lot of Muslims, some of whom migrated to Pakistan, became the Muhajir, and were the ruling class for a while. And they are the ones who basically built the concept of Pakistan, and who also brought Urdu, because Punjabis didn't speak Urdu, obviously they spoke Punjabi, and Urdu was made into the national language of Pakistan, even though the majority did not speak it. Pakistanis speak a variety of languages, beginning with Punjabi, with Seraikeli, Baloch, Sindhi, and the various idioms in between, and therefore Urdu was a sort of a top-down imposition, but it was intended to create a common identity, which to my mind is still not in existence. Because if you look at the various ethnic and religious groups in Pakistan, they may feel that they are one country as opposed to India, for example. But once you have said that, then it's true that among themselves there is a great deal of I would say there is a great deal of distance in many cases, and the communities live together or not so together, separately, but it's like in India where many communities don't necessarily mix and yet live together. However, in India, the fact that Hinduism is very all-embracing, and that there is a secular climate which enables people to live their own lives and do what they want. In Pakistan, there is heavy pressure from the major schools of Sunni jurisprudence, which means that minorities such as Shias and Ahmadiyyas are not really seen as equal citizens.
No, you highlighted many good points. One of the things which really struck to me, and I think I want to a little bit focus on that. Many of the ancient Hindu cultural sites are in Pakistan. Like Mahabharat was spoken there, and we already saw that. And you also gave a reference, Peshawar and Rawalpindi. Multan was a very famous Hindu sites. None of those sites are protected in Pakistan. What they have done is they have built their mosques on top of those religious sites, like they've done in India also. And it's a big danger to, like, if somebody wants to see a place where Mahabharat was spoken, most of the Indians cannot go today because those places are very much anti-India, especially those places. Then the entire Karachi port city was Rishi Pulastya area. Pulastya Rishi used to do tapasya over there, which is again covered now. Most of the places are not visitable. And also, Balochistan had a big temple, and recently some. So why is that Indians have given up on Pakistan? Because the Pakistan as a nation is historically a Hindu land, and but Indian government has taken that line to be too seriously. And so for terrorism we have Indian army regularly crosses, but the people inside are suffering also over there because of the Punjabi dominance. The Sindh culture is vanishing. Balochis are regularly persecuted. Pashtuns are regularly persecuted, and there's a whole range of human rights issue all over the Pakistan, today's Pakistan. But the Indian government seems to turn a blind eye on that. So does Pakistan as a nation really exist?
Listen, Pakistan as a nation exists because, like many nations, it has a government structure, it has an army, it has police forces, it has an administration, it has what the British called a steel frame, which is the bureaucracy. So at that point, you cannot deny the existence of Pakistan. And if you ask me, Pakistan has been pretty resilient because it has suffered very adverse circumstances where almost any nation would have been expected to break up. I mean, wars, disastrous infrastructure, overpopulation, lack of the most essential resources such as water, electricity, and even food. And yet Pakistan has held together so far, primarily because the army and the landed and industrial aristocracy stick together, and they are able to use the Islamic factor as a uniting element, which I guess so far, I mean, I still think that the Indian identity of Pakistanis has helped them because Indians are very resilient and whatever be their religion. So I guess Pakistani has also inherited that resilience. And as a result, it has kept its borders and it has kept its, obviously with support and help from a number of countries, including the United States and China. But the fact is that Pakistan has done better, if you ask me, than it could have been expected to do. And we don't know what the future holds. It seems that problems are becoming ever bigger in Pakistan. So we don't know how long Pakistan will be able to resist in its current state essentially the influence, the pressure of those growing issues. Nowadays it's becoming harder and harder for people to emigrate. So there are no places to emigrate to, and therefore, when you no longer have that ability to release millions of your own people into other lands, what do? Eventually you are courting disaster. And that is, I'm afraid, what very populated countries such as Pakistan, with meager resources, are going to face. They're already facing that. Now, as far as the Indian government is concerned, I don't know what else they can do. You have to treat Pakistan like an independent state, both legally and in terms of realities, in terms of current realities. And clearly, Pakistan becomes stronger if India looks aggressive or, vengeful. So, because then the Pakistanis can rally together and say we have to resist the big neighbor. And that is what has in a way kept Pakistan together. So the only thing one can do with Pakistan is to try to bring about a more reasonable polity, which would essentially seek to create strong economic and social ties with India and give up on this notion of a war to recover Kashmir and maybe other territories that Pakistan thinks it should claim. As long as the attitude of survival at the cost of India endures, there will be problems of the variety of the kind we know, simply because Pakistan finds its identity in the need to protect itself from India. And it is true that for India too, it has been a mobilizing factor because all countries in a way need, to an extent, need rivals or even enemies, maybe not enemies, but rivals at least, in order to keep the country together and keep the country moving forward. Otherwise, there tends to be a certain amount of disaffection that creeps in, and people only think of themselves and of how to, benefit personally, and they lose sight of the common causes. So I think, in that sense, Pakistan and India act as a foil to each other, but definitely there must be, and we hope there will be at some point, an improvement. Right now there is a slight détente between the two countries because the two armies have decided that they should observe a ceasefire and not, Pakistan has said they will not try to break through the border and send infiltrators. So far there seems to be a fair amount of compliance, so that's a very encouraging sign. But is that a passing stage, and will the old policy of conflict come back? We don't know. The idea of bleeding India with 1,000 cuts is certainly not an idea that will lose its momentum very quickly because of the many organizations in Pakistan which live basically to fight India and try to get hold of Kashmir. So as long as these organizations don't give up their ideals, and as long as the government sees it in its interest to keep them going, it's very difficult to change the situation. Now, to answer your question further, there has been a lot of talk for many years about a possible breakup of Pakistan. We don't know which countries will break up and which countries will stay together because we are entering a very turbulent period. So there will be a lot of trouble worldwide for sure. There already is. And for that reason, it is a bit idle to speculate. It's true that Balochistan is a very restless province, and the issue of the Durand line between Afghanistan and Pakistan has not been settled, which means that a lot of Pashtuns in the northwestern frontier province are actually feeling that they are Afghans and they should be with Afghanistan and not with Pakistan. So there are many problems like that. But then again, until now, the largely Punjabi elite of Pakistan has been able to keep the country together.
That's right. I think the one community's predominance over others is too much over there. And last but not the least, you said something important over there in the last point. You mentioned that why Pakistan still exists as an independent country. But my point is that culturally, they are all Hindus. Culturally, they may not admit it, but all their customs, their marriages, the the way they maintain their places are all Hindu culture predominantly, which they fail to recognize consistently. And the point is that if they and the most of the Arabs, and I've seen most of the Arabs talking about them, call them kafir, like the or mushrik, like they are, they're not considered pure Muslims by Arabs and even Persians also. And so very little identification they have. They may think whatever they have, like every Pakistani will say their ancestors came from Arab, every single of them, most of them, and not all of them, but they will say Arabs and other people communities. So severe identity crisis is due to the last 70 years of propaganda in their textbooks. The textbooks, they are very much against anything Hindu. The their surnames are still Hindu. Many of them are Shah, and these are all Hindu surnames, including the Afghanistanis have that surname also. But as a country, they have a problem in all these future generation. Current generation has a huge problem, and for them, they cannot exist without India. Day and night, they watch Indian movies, they watch Indian news, they don't trust their own news. So all these things make it up that why are they still calling themselves separate country, because they cannot live without India. If India is not there, they will disintegrate in 10 pieces. It's the India factor is uniting them every day. So why not they become a 31st province of India, 32nd or 33rd, whatever it is.
You'll get in trouble and you'll get me in trouble by saying that. Number one, Pakistan, as you know, is 4 different provinces.
Correct.
But this being said, I would say, by the way, to add to what you were just saying about Indian movies in Pakistan, that Indians also, at least some Indians, do watch Pakistani TV series, which are generally quite good, actually. So, Pakistan that way has a rather select audience in India. Which is well deserved, because I think the Pakistanis do a very good job with some of their TV series. Now, if you go back to Mohammed Iqbal,
It used to be the case 20 years back, not now.
well, now they also produce some good TV series because they are modernized a lot and they do things that are quite intellectually or at least culturally, of some quality. But this being said, if you go back to Mohammed Iqbal, the great poet, philosopher, who was perhaps the first proponent of Pakistan. He's the one who inspired Jinnah and other founding fathers of Pakistan, and he used to say that this whole northwestern and northern part of India should get into a federation, should join a federation with Iran, Turkey, and perhaps Iraq and Syria. So that was an early idea. I'm talking about the 1920s or even earlier. And so that idea remained that somehow there should be that great Muslim, South Asian, and Western Asian confederacy. Now, that is obviously not on the cards, and it sounds like a distant dream because, the idea of making a sort of a European Union on the basis of shared religious and identity and cultural connections, it may be very appealing to some, but obviously it has never come into being. The closest thing that happened was the alliance called CENTO, which was the Central alliance which was forged by the British and the Americans against the Soviets, and which indeed brought together Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey. But that didn't last very long, and afterwards, national politics came back, and Pakistan has remained in its own corner.
Yeah, like the when they talk about Kashmir, Kashmir is again a Hindu name, Kashyap's garden, and Jiljil Baltistan is where Adi Sankaracharya set up the first Sharda Peeth. Mahabharat was spoken in Takshila. Karachi, an entire Sindh area, is called Pulasya Rishi, Raja Dahir's territory, which is well known. They also accept it. And so, why not all these parts and Balochistan join with India and let the Punjabi Pakistan be treated as a separate country? Like, this can be a solution also because uh, we have seen one thing: Hindu culture brings peace and prosperity, and also it becomes a more reliable partner of the Western world because they work cooperatively. There is no vengeance, there is no fighting. Even though British ruled India very ruthlessly, rather ruthlessly on India, but still there is a Hindu kind of mindset of live and let live that doesn't exist in many other communities also. So do you think, is that a distant possibility according to you? I'm not putting on you on the spot, you can really deny to answer.
Uh, who knows what the future will bring. If you look at Punjab, it's really one province, and there is no border of any kind between, no natural border between Pakistani Punjab and Indian Punjab, which used to be Punjab, Haryana, include Punjab, Haryana, and what is now Himachal. So the Punjab Hills. So that was all one region, and there is really no separation. Practically Amritsar and Lahore geographically are sister cities. And Lahore used to be the capital of Sri Ram's son, Lava. So, if you go back to Ramayana, you find a lot of connections with Pakistan as well. Therefore, there is no separation there. And of course, for the Pakistanis, that's a problem in a way because, there is that whole Islamic theory of Jahiliyyah. Whatever preceded Islam was pagan and therefore is not to be glorified, right? I mean, so they are not comfortable claiming their Indian Hindu credentials. But that could also change. Mindsets can change, and it might take a few years, it might take decades, it might even take a century. But eventually, you might see a grand reunification coming through a form of federation, or who knows. But certainly, Sindh is very close to India in so many ways. Balochistan is a different case because Balochistan is actually closer to Afghanistan and Iran, and therefore, that's a very sort of tribal, nomadic culture. So we don't know. But the fact is that the Indus Valley is very much part of that whole valley system, Punjab, the five rivers, and then Yamuna and Ganga. So there is that whole nexus. And the very fact that you have to divide the waters between the rivers, between the two countries, that in itself is a very vexing issue because you must argue forever about how much water one country gets and how much water the other country has to get. So let's hope that something like that eventually happens, that they manage to settle the differences and the animosities and they can come back together in peace.
Yeah, it will be a great for Hindus to visit their religious sites in Pakistan freely, and also protect them because according to me, Takshila is a great site of learning. And somehow it has been destroyed. And even yesterday, I was checking some Google Maps. The old temple, which was there last 1 year, it is also gone now. And so it pains the history lovers like us. We are trying to talk about the history and the culture and building back the native culture systems, because native cultures have flourished for a long time. They have a high resilience and they are still there. The Hindu culture is so old, many people can't even estimate the age. And just by looking at the cities, where the traditions have never been stopped till date. So that is will be my desire, that at least we should be able to go in a friendly way to our religious sites in Pakistan, which is filled with them. Like, at least I counted 60 to 80,000 religious Hindu sites spread around Afghanistan and Pakistan, which were Indian territories before 1947, before 1990. So thank you, Come. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and all the viewers who loved it, and I asked all your questions. So, thank you all for joining it live, and those who could not watch it live. Very interesting conversation based on the request of one of my Pakistani friends, who is a major lover of Modi. Can you believe that? And he,
That happens, yes.
yes, and who asked me to arrange this show and ask Come Carpentier based on one of his earlier articles. So thank you so much for joining, and watch us on YouTube and let us know your feedback. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.